it was pretty clear pretty fast that we weren't seeing many students of color in our office. They felt that they had often gotten the feedback that if they were struggling, that they should just choose a different path. I could say, you know what, I don't want to think about this, it's not my story, whatever, but I don't want to.
Welcome to Women We Should Know with international speaker, mindset reset mentor, author, and your host, Lesley Michaels. With audacious honesty and candor, the Women We Should Know podcast presents the wisdom and life-empowering insights of women who are the embodiments of innovation and social evolution. Please join Lesley as she shares potent conversations that will inspire your personal and professional evolutions.
Hi, I'm Lesley Michaels, and I am so glad you are joining us today. There's so much going on in the world, and between COVID and so many other elements, we're feeling a bit topsy-turvy. And the topic I wanted to speak about today is race. Certainly, this is a topic that deserves to be spoken about more, and that we must start communicating about more and hearing and listening and having real conversations and learning what we don't understand and what we can't understand, especially if you are, like me, fair complected, blonde, blue-eyed. And so I invited a very special friend of mine today. Sarah Berger is Senior Advisor in the health professions at Dartmouth. And this is an amazing woman who has taken great steps in bringing race into the conversation on the campus, among the students, within the administration. And I am delighted for you to hear how she accomplished this. And as to why, as long as I've known Sarah, probably since Sarah could walk, above all else, one of her greatest joys has been witnessing people removing the obstacles that have been limiting them. And she likes to say this is her greatest joy. And what I have witnessed personally is that she is a mighty advocate for individuals who are ready to step up and take that challenge. So I'm very excited to introduce you today to Sarah Berger.
Hi, Lesley. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a joy, even if a little bit of a scary joy, to sit here and have this dialogue with you. I'm very excited about it. Thank you for thinking of me.
Absolutely. And I'm delighted to have you come and join us and speak with us about something that you've really taken a very forward stance with and are having a tremendous effect on untold numbers of people. If we may, I would like to start with the panel that you assembled by calling alums and creating a conversation that could be witnessed and participated in by the current student body.
Yeah, I know you're referring to a recent panel that we did. So I work with college undergraduate students who are interested in the profession of medicine. And most of the students I work with are specifically gearing themselves towards being physicians, though we also have students interested in nursing and other professions. The majority in our sphere here are interested in physicianhood. It's a very, very special group of students in general. For the vast majority of them, they are genuinely devoted to being of service to others. And one of the things that we see in the journey is that some of the same issues that are reflected in our greater social space are reflected in the journey towards healthcare and medicine as a profession and in the profession as well. And that includes issues of racism and sort of structural, where bias and racism is actually embedded in the structure that creates obstacles in students' progress. I just want to say too, like, I'm not an expert. There are so many people more expert than myself in this conversation. So I really want to be clear about that. An individual with a lot of passion and about this arena, and, you know, trying to figure out, like, what can one person do in the space that they're in.
And that is exactly why I invited you to the show today. We all hear and see the experts and learn a great deal from them. I wanted to bring forward today someone who is not a quote unquote expert and yet is opening doors for many, many people as an example that every one of us can. And in my personal opinion, every one of us should. So thank you for coming and sharing.
Thank you, Lesley. You know, you asked this question about this panel, and, you know, it's a great question. It's, you're referring to a conversation we recently had, and for me, it's a small event that we did that reflects some sort of big journeys that have been happening over the last several years. It was a panel of some of our students of color who have moved into the field of medicine. They're either finishing up med school or actually already in their residency and, you know, becoming fully fledged doctors. And one of the things that was true when I started the job, it was pretty clear pretty fast that while we were pretty busy, we weren't seeing many students of color in our office. And that included Black students, that included students who identified as Latinx, that included students who identify as Native or Indigenous. And the first relationships I was lucky enough to start to be able to build really came through our Black students. And they started to entrust me with helping me understand why they were coming. What the association had grown to be with coming and being vulnerable with their aspirations. I've come to really appreciate, I tend to sort of orient myself around like alternative, health and alternative medicine, but this has taught me such an appreciation for the work involved in becoming a physician, this realm that I'm in. So much work just to even get there, just to even get to medical school. And, what I was learning was that students who identified as students of color were experiencing a lot of obstacles to even feel successful in the coursework, to even move forward to that aspiration. So it can it can take a lot of flavors. And some of the flavors that the students told me about was in previous experiences with, say, advisors doing this type of work. They felt that they had often gotten the feedback that if they were struggling, that they should just choose a different path. That it probably meant it wasn't for them. That it probably wasn't the right path. Why don't we look at something that's easier? Why don't we look at a different journey for you? And so that was the first piece of information I was getting from students as to why they weren't coming in. They were finding their own ways to do the journey, or they were just disenfranchising from the journey, just moving away from it altogether, dropping the goal, period. And sort of taking that information, assuming it was true. So, what I was noticing was, students were kind of banding together to figure out their own resources instead of, using the resources that the Dartmouth was trying to provide for them. In reaching out directly to the students, they were so generous with letting me understand that. They also, I think some of the things that are happening right now after the George Floyd murder experience, the heightened awareness around Black Lives Matter, which then heightens the awareness in general about racism in our country and in many of our structures. There's so many subtle ways that plays out. And so students started to share more with me that I did know some of these things, but I wasn't as aware of them. And the experience of walking into a classroom, they do a lot of science courses to do this work, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And even though the professors themselves might not have been aware or intending, having the experience of feeling, consistently underestimated, have a sense that, again, a feeling of there being a presumption of a challenge equals inability, or a challenge equals lack of genuine interest. Dartmouth is a great institution, a great college, and a fantastic education, but there's no starting point. If a student hasn't had the opportunity to have a really deep introduction to the sciences, for instance, there's no starting point, to jump them in otherwise.
Right. There's no process by which they can leapfrog forward to where they need to be.
Exactly. And at least there were some attempts made, but they hadn't turned out to be super successful, even though some goodwill had gone into creating them, and they weren't consistent. And so, right against, another wonderful student who might have had like fantastic opportunities, and another student who really didn't have the same opportunities, were in the same class. And, a median is a median. And, a student that might be struggling might get the feedback, or at least experience the sense that the feedback was one that lacked faith in their ability from the faculty. And similarly, like, why are you even trying this? Or, I don't think pre-health is for you. I don't think medicine is for you. That, again, was their experience. So they weren't feeling very trusting about employing or engaging with faculty support, et cetera. I don't want to make a universal statement, because I think that's a mistake a lot of us make. And I say by us, I mean people in general, but I want to specifically say maybe, white individuals who create monolithic, humans do this in general, create these monolithic ideas about groups of people. And I think one of the most important things that I've had to really not only make sure I'm reminding myself of, but make sure the people that I'm surrounded by, kind of remind as well, is that, we're talking about very individual stories. So there may be some themes, and there may be patterns that we can look at that are relevant and meaningful. But if as soon as you start to say, like, well, all students who were Black must have come from a less resourced high school, it's just not true. You have students who came from great high schools from all backgrounds, and students who came from lesser resourced from all backgrounds. But there are some unique hurdles that those students experience who identify as students of color, what I will say underrepresented students of color. And that included the feeling of having other people's doubt in them, and internalization of that, I think, was really important to reckon with. There are some concepts that maybe some of you know about. There's one concept called stereotype threat. I think that's really important to understand if you're involved at all in education, politics.
Please explain that one, Sarah.
Yeah. And again, I'm not the expert in it. You may perhaps want to read the work of somebody named Sean Harper, and there's other great experts out there. But the concept of stereotype threat suggests that when a person hears a certain message over and over again, it perpetuates the nature of that message. So if somebody is experiencing doubt about their right to be on a campus like Dartmouth's, or to be successful in a science course or in the profession of, say, medicine, and that they're getting this experience back at them, it starts to become such that I've seen this happen, even students who had a great background, wind up entering that testing environment, and that experience of self-doubt becomes manifest in the experience. Not, again, across the board. We have many students who maybe didn't experience that, but you see that experience happen in the idea of stereotype threat. And it can exist for a lot of different groups of people in different ways, but it can really be profoundly expressed in the STEM experience. The STEM, for people who don't know, is the science, technology, engineering, and math type courses. It can be really strongly expressed there.
Well, that makes sense, though, really, because many of us know that what we hear over and over again, or what we say to ourselves over and over again, becomes reality. Mm-hmm. And it is important to speak in a positive way to ourselves, but to also only have those around us who speak in a positive, uplifting way. And I can see easily where this could be multiplied in a positive or negative for these underrepresented students, because they have multiple messages
exactly
coming through as to their basic beingness as Black students or students of color, of any culture.
And, it's like you're talking about. I mean, in our day-to-day lives, we might be very consciously intending to choose, like, hey, I want to be with somebody who uplifts me. I want to be around people who are, kind of positive with my goals and, part of my tribe of cheering team. But in an environment that is, in this case, majority white, and this is the course you're assigned to do with these goals. These are the people that are in your dorm. There are moments in a day or a week where, yes, for this hour, I'm choosing these people to hang out with, but that's not always what students have a choice about. So, I've talked to students who've discussed the fact that, they've arrived at Dartmouth and started out having some, really positive experiences in those first few days of orientation. And then somebody on their floor says something about them only being here because of affirmative action. So those were the first messages that I was hearing. I certainly talked to colleagues who, when I brought this up with them, to say, like, is this stuff that's being talked about? Is this stuff that you've also noticed? It sounds like some people hadn't noticed some of these things, but weren't quite sure what to do about it. And, again, occasionally a professor would try a course that, maybe get some funding to try on a course. And I guess I thought, well, my first instinct was to be like, the sort of New Yorker pushy part of me was just like, you all do something different. Like, I wanted to like sound the alarm and to make sure everybody knew. And it was like, well, okay, a lot of people know it's not maybe as much the issue as I thought, but maybe not totally as aware of how entrenched it is. Because it's painful to acknowledge, it's painful to realize, because, I have wonderful people who don't intend to be harming other people. That's not their goal. So I really
that brings up a really important point within the racial conversation, the conversation about racism, the conversation about recognition and upliftment of each other. And that is the idea of well-intending people who don't mean to do harm, but are not taking the extra step to learn how to not just settle for not doing harm, but how to be proactive in being a benefit, which is another reason I brought you to this podcast today.
Thank you, Lesley. And I think that the thing too is even the not doing harm is investigating that, right? Because there could be no intention to do harm, but one's passive participation or acceptance of the system or the structure that we're operating in could still be causing harm. And so, it doesn't have to be an intentional act to be a fully fledged participant. And I think the events that are going on right now really highlights that. And, and this is a passion I've had most of my life consciously. And even so, I still feel on a continuous journey of awareness around this. I don't think there's like a resting point, so
we don't get a day off. We don't get a day off. We have to keep being diligent. We have to keep learning. We have to continue to have sometimes easy, but very often hard conversations, because if we don't, if those of us who are pushy broads don't, then those who find it easy to sit down and take a day off will.
Well, I think that's true. And I think that it's important to remember that the people who are living in darker skin, especially from underrepresented groups, don't get to take a day off. Like I could say, you know what, I don't want to think about this. It's not my story, whatever. I could do that if I wanted to, but I don't want to. but I really don't have the choice if I am living in the skin of a Black person or a person from another group who have similar experiences, and to recognize that. And I do think that what's happening right now has maybe amplified, or even for the first time for a lot of people, really to turn the light on of that this is a minute by minute, day to day experience, and you know, a Black person may not may not be thinking about it every minute of every day, but it's part of their experience every minute of every day, and
Right.
the potential anticipation or threat or stress of it exists within their bodies every day. And you know, some of the things that have been extremely powerful to learn about over the last several years, 10 years or so, has been, you know, this isn't even just about being nicer to each other and better to each other and all those really nice thoughts. This is really deep systemic stuff, and it's not. It affects people's at the cellular level. Living with that stress day in and day out is a cellularly experienced health affecting process. And you know, we now actually have studies that really demonstrate the really powerful effects of the day-to-day stress of living in racism. And you know, we have I think the highest maternal death rate in the quote unquote developed world, and I say that on purpose, which is crazy, ridiculous, and especially among Black women. I should highlight that that's what I meant, was among Black women. You know, there's a woman right here at Dartmouth named Professor Zanetta Thayer, who's done some of the groundbreaking work at looking at the epigenetics of stress of women who've experienced racism, that their children are born already with higher levels of cortisol. They're already
Really?
Yeah, they're already potentially on the way to having higher health risks.
That is fascinating.
It is fascinating. And the belief that many people have carried, you know, this is a country that talks a lot about like, pull yourself up from your own bootstraps, blah, 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 and create all sorts of excuses for why, you know, why they might hold a race, they might not think of it, but why they hold a racist thought about a group of people. You know, the understanding that there's so many profound historical structural reasons why racism continues to exist. But what does that mean? You know, it means, you know, not being able to vote for a representative in your own community. It means not being able to get a loan in some communities because of what's called redlining, you know, and the ability for the laws that have been made to limit access to influence and power and income and housing. It's just profound how deep these things run. And so even if you personally, as a Black person or as a person of color, grew up in a more affluent community, the way you're seen and the impacts of the structures you bump into and the limits that have been created by these, you know, 400-year-old, you know, issues and laws in this country alone is so profound. And here it was showing up among students who just want to go out and help people and become doctors. And the experience of feeling like the opportunity, you know, having been at the top of their class, wherever they came from, and then hitting these walls when they first came here, was absolutely keeping me up at night. And if it's keeping me up at night, what's it doing to them? You know, what's it doing in their own skins?
Well, I'm glad it was keeping you up at night. I can't think of a better person for them to have as an advocate. So I'm eager to hear about, and I'm eager for our audience to hear about this panel you created, which I'd like to say on the side, because I know you won't blow your own horn, that this is just one in a number of things that you have brought to the campus in order to bring race and racism into the conversation on the campus, in the classrooms, among the students, among the faculty. So let's hear about this one thing that you did.
I mean, I don't want to overstate my influence. I would say that it's within a certain sphere, and I don't know that
it's
in all those levels. So I want to be super careful about that. But I definitely feel that the work that we've done, and I say we because I've really worked with the students and now alumni and some of the other campus stakeholders. I want to, and I'll move into the question about the panel now, but there is no, from my point of view, there is no doing this work as an individual person coming in and saying, I'm going to help you.
Of course not.
I think that is another thing that has been I'd like to say I really started out from that point of view, and I did to some degree. But I think that it was something that really exponentially grew very, very quickly. It was my orientation to start with, but very, very quickly, the students are the stakeholders.
Of course they are. And it is not that we can do anything but be present. And certainly we can't individually make a change, but one person.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I want to relay to our audience today. One person
at a time.
Such as yourself can walk in and open a door that no one else was feeling comfortable opening. And then, although you did not create every conversation, you did not participate in every conversation, you opened a door that wasn't previously opened. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the purpose of this podcast for me, is encouraging people, particularly women, to open those doors that no one else has been willing to open yet, and see what happens.
Thank you, Lesley. I appreciate that. So the panel, I would say, is a reflection. So a few weeks ago, at the end of our spring term, which, like all colleges, was remote for our students. And and again, I say we, myself and some students and some alumni worked together to develop an initiative that we call Pathways to Medicine, when we started noticing some of those issues earlier. And Pathways to Medicine became a space for bringing students of color together at least a few times a year with each other, to realize they were not alone. Because what was often happening was a student would say they get to a point and there's like, I look around and I'm like the only Black person left in this class. So to realize, like, I'm not the only person wanting to do this journey, to have a support system in-house, to begin to build a network of alumni as well, and to have better information and understanding of like how to get through those obstacles. If you're hitting the wall academically or psychically, that is okay. Like, let's talk about that. What can you do about that? What are strategies that can work for you? What are other resources you can use on campus? What are other ways to get to your aspirations? And we've had really amazing, I don't want to say stories, because that, like, I don't want to reduce any individual to a story, but like, we've had amazing experiences of seeing students who became alumni who didn't even think they'd ever make it, they're not only in med school, they are now fully fledged doctors. And so we have a lot lot of that experience now in front of us, which is, I'll cry. I'm gonna start
beautiful.
It honestly is very beautiful. And if, to have played some role in that is actually extraordinary. The panel that Lesley's talking about was, here we are being remote. It's much harder to have that sense of community. We were supposed to run a program this spring that would have been the third iteration of a development from the Pathways program that we call Pathway Scholars, that I was able to initiate through getting a grant to actually have a more concrete term-long program to meet every week with a group of students who applied to be part of it, who committed to be part of it, and where the focus was to study the social determinants of health and social justice in medicine and healthcare. So this was meant to be our third iteration of that this spring. We weren't able to do that. We wanted to at least do something, and I'll talk about that project in a little bit too. And so, we've gotten pretty used to doing Zoom and doing some Zoom webinars. So
Zoom experts at this point.
Exactly. And one of the great cool things about it is, because we have so many awesome alumni out there, we could actually have a panel that reached out to even more people than usual if we were just on campus, which was super, super duper cool. We now have like this wonderful list now of alumni. When we first started looking for alumni who were physicians of color, it was so, I had alumni helping me look, really influential alumni helping me look. I had current students. It was really hard to find. And, our list is very long now and very exciting. And so I personally had to stop myself because, a panel can only be so big. So I asked, I stopped at asking 9 people, which is a big panel, But everybody says
And
yes.
that was probably very hard for you.
I did a lot of mulling on where to start, which 9 people should I start with, because there were so many others that would have been awesome to have. What I was telling Lesley was, I didn't say much. It was their communication with the current students about their journeys. And what was so moving, it was moving to me in a few ways. One way was that they were all there, period. These weren't people who were hoping to get into medicine. These were people who were now in medicine.
Right.
And they were now talking to students with the same aspiration. We've had that experience before, but this was just a little different seeing it this way. The other thing that was really striking to me, I want to talk about language and being forthright, which is where Lesley started. When we first started doing this program, I felt like we almost had to be a little bit sneaky and kind of be a little bit around the bush about it. The students themselves were willing to be very direct and forthright and say what their needs were. Very early on in the process, I explicitly said, I was like, okay, I'm going to be really straight with you. The college is very concerned about anything that looks like targeting. If we move forward with this idea about pathways to medicine, how do you feel? It would mean then directly reaching out to students of color. And they were like, we need to be targeted where we don't have the resources we need. We don't have the support that we need. That is what we need.
That is such a key example. That is such a key example of what I believe is hindering a lot of people from helping. We have all these words like we don't want to be targeting, we don't want to be this, and we don't. But instead of making decisions for other people, I am so respectful of the fact that you went to them and asked them, does this feel like targeting, or is this something that you want? And that goes back to what but so many people with more impact and more expertise than I have been saying, that we must expand our conversations. So I'm thrilled that you brought that point forward.
Thanks, Lesley. It's, the word targeting itself is loaded because there's, it's a word that can be used in really terrible ways. But in this case, it meant reaching out directly. It meant being direct. It meant being frank about the experience an individual was having with their real lives, and finding out what their real needs were. And we were being careful at the time. And so we would advertise to the students that this was a program for students of color. But if we express that outside of our realm to other administrators, et cetera, there would be a great sense of uneasiness by actually having stated that, by really being frank about somebody being a Black person, et cetera. And we did have, so don't get me wrong, we do have an Office of Pluralism. We did have a Black student advisor. Not like we never talked about Black students or Native students or Latinx students, but there was something about this really specifically talking about students of color within our space of medicine, STEM, et cetera, in a really direct way. Not just first generation students or not just low income students, because it doesn't fit all those categories. The panel was such a cool, experience in so many ways, that one of the ways was that I could see the journey of the individuals, of their comfort of being so direct. When I first met the students that I was meeting, we might be frank with each other, but they didn't feel always that comfortable being frank externally. And I think because of how heightened things have been the last few years, and that people have been talking directly about the experiences of being a person that's Black or brown in our country. And our panel happened to happen right after the George Floyd murder, that everybody on the panel was just so frank. Everybody on the panel just talked about what it was to be them. And they used the words that the power of the word, the power of saying something that's true, the power of saying that's something that's what's so. And I think one of the painful things for me anyway, because I am not an expert in this, but one of the painful things for me as a person and an individual, and I'm not always great at this myself, is when a word isn't what it means, when a word doesn't say when a word beats around the bush, when you you talk about inclusion or diversity, but it's vague and non-specific and it lacks action. So it's really been amazing recently to hear colleagues who have felt very cautious about talking about things, starting to talk about things. White students, where there was just an announcement today among some of our white students who, because of the summer term, we have a summer term here at Dartmouth, is also remote, that they're, I forget what they're calling it, but the Greek system wants to really delve into understanding more about the experience of people of color and Black people in particular, and to support Black Lives Matter, to do fundraising, and to do their own education. I think that's another really important thing that you hear people saying, and students have said this to me many, many times, is it is exhausting to become the spokesperson for educating everybody who's trying to figure stuff out. So it's not uncommon at all for many of the students I've talked to describe being in a class, for instance, a class that might address issues of disparity or racism. And when the topic specifically may come up about racism, like everybody gets quiet, everybody looks at them to try to be like, you tell us what it's like. And I would say over the last several years, I've seen students get more and more brave and resistant to that, to just not to do it when they want to, but not to feel obligated to do it, because honestly, it's exhausting. And you hear that now. I have one woman friend in particular who is Black, who is being very, very clear with her friends and her network, to remind everybody that please you go buy a book, you educate yourself. There's plenty of stuff out there. And don't keep asking all of your people in your network who may be people of color to do that work for you. You be proactive and do it for yourself. And working directly as an individual here in an educational environment, I feel that experience of inviting the students to be participants in our creation and the pathways process. Like if we're going to create an event, if we're going to create programming, I might, as the administrator, do a lot of legwork and kind of keep it sustained. And I do a lot of that. They come, they go, of course, but this is your experience. What do you need? Who do you want to hear from? And the Pathway Scholars Program, yes, I initiated that and oversaw it, but I do the work with students. It's, students, we help design the curriculum. We reach out to the stakeholders who are going to be our speakers this term, where we're traveling to. We've gone on trips to Washington, D.C. and to more locally to Burlington, Vermont, in each of our two Pathway Scholars terms, so that we could talk to people on the ground who are doing the work, actually addressing the issues of social determinants of health in their community. So it's not just theoretical, we're not just talking theoretically, and that the students themselves can have a place. And the students have said, when we were, unfortunately, again, we didn't get to do it this spring, but in both iterations that we've done, one of the things that's been the most moving to me is students saying, this is the one place I come each week where I feel like I can be totally myself outside of just being socially with my friends, where I can talk about what's really on my mind. And
how does that feel for you, having been kind of the genesis of some of this? I know you are this bold, grew up all over the streets of New York female. So you're no shrinking violet, Sarah. But still, to be in this environment and be able to empower people to that degree, how does that feel for you? What does that feel like? Is it joyous? Is it a responsibility? What is it like?
Both. Right now I'm tearing up just thinking about it. It's not something I take for granted. I give credit to everybody who's involved in helping to create it. It's exceptionally moving. It's both. It's extremely extremely tender feeling, because if that's true, when it's true, it's based on trust that we've co-created, and if I've had the capacity to develop some of that trust with individuals who often feel vulnerable in many settings. It's moving in a way that's really hard to describe. It's it's an honor that's hard to describe, and not one that I take for granted. And I don't take it for granted that, like, okay, if that was how somebody felt today, that means I've got this down. And I'm like, I don't think that way. Like, it's just like, okay, if we're going to do another program or another iteration, that means from the ground up, we build a new body of trust with this new group of students, with a new group of stakeholders. I really feel that this is an ongoing, constant process. And if I'm called out on something, if one of the very first big events, we've been doing a summer retreat day, because we have sophomores on campus in the summer, typically, not this year. And we'll have a retreat day where we bring the sophomores who identify as being from underrepresented groups interested in this field. We'll bring mentors in, we'll bring alumni and we have a med school right here as well. We really have a beautiful day together. I am pretty much always the only white person in the room, and that has been true every time, except for one. And I've facilitated many workshops throughout my life, and I'm used to sort of thinking about the flow and designing the workshop. And I was working with two other people, stakeholders, a student and a colleague, to build the first curriculum for our first retreat day. And before we actually did it, I wasn't necessarily thinking I had to be like in the front, announcing everything. But the student who I was working with was very gently was like, I want to bring up one thing, maybe you shouldn't necessarily be the person like introducing everything at the front end. Like, is it okay with you if one of us as a person of color is like, of course, like, oh, absolutely, of course. And it was not so much if a student or a stakeholder or colleague feels comfortable enough to tell me something that they need that I might have recognized, or that's part of the trust for me. If they feel comfortable enough to be like,
that's brilliant.
Leadership, as much as we appreciate your leadership, like.
That's a beautiful thing, that they are students, they are stakeholders, you are part of the administration. That speaks volumes to the level of trust. What I want to say is that you must be endowing upon them, because we don't receive trust until we give it first, do we?
Well, I suppose that's an interesting point. I think that, I don't want to presume other people's feelings or experiences, but the way you said that is important, I think, because if an experience that someone's having of any background is of being doubted and not trusted, and one not having faith in them as a whole person, is something that actually becomes systemic. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that word.
Gets built into law, gets built into policy.
Yes.
That becomes self-serving, so that a law that might have originally been built to sustain someone's economic stake, for instance. The book Stamped from the Beginning, I really want to encourage people to read that or listen to it. It's a great way to really, really get, if somebody's still like questioning this, to really get how deeply embedded these issues are at the core of like our institutions, like how far back it goes, and where some of the motivations have come for instituting structures and policies. And for instance, he brings up a lot of he's way too articulate for me to try to do any justice to it. The information is so profound, but policy might have been initiated to be self-serving, but then in order to justify it, relied on a racist premise, developed a racist premise to justify it. And then the racist premise becomes embedded in both the system, the institution, and the psyche of the community, and perpetuates and perpetuates and perpetuates. If you ever get a chance to go to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, that's another space where you are literally physically walked through that history. They physically found a way to walk you through that history. Anybody who's not sure about that, really give yourself that experience, because it really helps someone, I think, in your body, in your mind, even if you're still feeling like intellectually, like, is this like really, like, is this totally like so pervasive? And I think that's one of the tensions that a lot of people feel when they are confronted with the question of whether or not they participate in bias and racism. Because most people want to think of themselves and do believe that, genuinely try to live as like a quote unquote good person, whatever that means, and not fully acknowledge both, again, we talked about earlier, both how they might be participating in this very well-established system, because it's, it's like the frog in boiling water. You don't know your own element when you're in it. And then on top of that, all the very, very many wonderfully embedded subtle biases that contribute, that we all have. And if we can't own them and deal with them and acknowledge them, how are we going to change this? I want to really also plug, like, the New York Times a few years ago created a whole series of tiny little videos. They're only each a couple of minutes long, but if you looked up New York Times bias videos, they are a fantastic introduction to anybody who's like, I'm really wanting to figure this out. I really wanted to see what this all means. And that's a really gentle way into thinking about some of this stuff. Anyway.
Wonderful. And I know not everybody can get to DC, to the Smithsonian.
Exactly.
But another place that I was really impacted because they were so truthful about the history was the Martin Luther King Jr. Museum in Memphis. Mm-hmm. And if that's closer for you to go to, I cried half the way through it. And as you know, Sarah, I'm not a big crier, but it was just, I felt such shame as, and it's not that I had been out there doing those things personally, but a historical shame. It's tremendously impactful. One of the things that you just spoke of brought me back, and I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, and I don't want to miss this. You spoke of us being aware, just being aware of where our biases are, our hidden biases. And one of the conversations we recently had was an examination of the idea of how many times that you and I, as fair-complected, blonde, blue-eyed, very non-color individuals, are offered and treated with white privilege and don't notice. Not because we're not paying attention, but because we don't expect it. Mm-hmm. But we're also not radically on guard towards it. We're sitting in that middle, mm-hmm. being attentive, calling it out when we see it. But how many times does it slide by? And that's a wonderful place to invite other people to start noticing, because since you and I had that conversation, I have been a little bit more attentive than what I was before.
Mm-hmm. If it's your element, I used frogs in the boiling water before. That was probably the wrong, more the idea of the fish in the ocean who, how do you know what water is if it's what you're always in?
Right.
And I know many, many people feel very sensitive to the idea of white privilege. I came from a fairly low income background. I was a first-gen college student. And I understand that a lot of people might feel that they're not, they have their own struggles, they have their own challenges. A person might be feeling like, I don't feel privileged. I don't feel like I have privilege. Or somebody who maybe really does have privilege might just be like, yeah, but like I earned it. I worked for it. Which may also be true that they worked hard. I'm not saying that's not true, but I think that sense of what is allowed for, what don't we worry about? What don't we think about? What are we allowed to not carry or ponder or fear? I mean, as a woman, I've had many a walk, many a time where I feel very nervous about being a woman walking alone at night, for instance. But day in and day out, I don't feel that way in most settings. I'm aware of being a woman, but I'm only fearful of sometimes. I have the privilege of walking around, not thinking about my safety the majority of the time.
Yes.
And I have the privilege of, and this isn't always true, but I can mostly expect that when I talk to somebody, they're going to take me at face value. They're not necessarily going to say, oh, you went to Dartmouth College? Huh. With surprise.
Right.
I don't expect to be questioned every time I project myself into the world one way or the other. There's so many subtle things that I can walk into a store and not be followed, and I'm not thinking, oh, isn't this great that I'm not being followed? I don't think about it. That's my privilege, that I'm not worried about that.
I can pull up to a stoplight and there's a police car beside me, and I might just nod the way you do to anyone. I don't have to think about whether or not I'm at risk. I don't have to be nervous. That is privilege. And I don't think that we are acclimated to recognizing how it might be minutia to us, but it is a significant part of someone else's day just because their skin is a different shade.
I mean, you've probably seen some of the studies, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but there have been some really interesting studies done on what happens when you send resumes in with names that look traditionally kind of Western European, and names that look like they could be, what people might associate as Black names or Latinx names, and the difference in how employers read resumes unwittingly, mostly unwittingly, but still what a profound impact that has. So even submitting a resume, I might not be chosen because of what I bring to the table, but I'm not discarded because of my name.
That's right.
And, there's so many spaces like that. I now have met so many amazing students of color and colleagues that, my own awareness is very heightened. If I see this is a very rural, pretty safe environment, but if I see a Black man walking alone on a street around here in broad daylight, I get anxious. I get worried. If I see somebody driving, I'm anxious. I'm fearful for what their experience might be like, and I'm not even in their own skin. So.
Oh, but I do not want our listeners to miss what you just said. You're nervous, you're anxious, but you're not nervous or anxious because it's a man of color walking down the street. You're nervous or anxious for what they might experience.
That's right. That's actually.
I had to capture that.
God, thank you for differentiating that. Yes, I'm nervous for them. I'm not nervous for me.
That's right. I definitely wanted that to be captured because it's a different concept. It's a different way of looking at the people we see walking down the street. Sarah, I could sit here as you and I have done when we're not recording a podcast and go on and on for hours. You are so welcome. I'd like to ask you, what is one thing, one little tiny, easy to do, little succinct thing that you would invite our listeners to start incorporating in their lives just to develop and fine-tune their own awareness around how they truly do think and feel about race?
That's a great question. I might say two things. So one thing, briefly, because I know we don't have much time, would be a compassionate practice of awareness. And I say compassion is very important because it is. And the ability to start to notice, I just had this thought about this person. I just made this assumption. And that could be about any person. But just the practice of noticing assumptions that we make about people who cross our path will strengthen the muscle and the courage to notice where those moments come up when one interacts or encounters somebody that is either a stranger, a person of color who is a stranger to you, or a colleague or a boss or anybody else in your space. And I say you, I say me too. I mean, I don't mean you, somebody out there. And many of you may be way more far down the line in this journey than I am, and maybe way more experts, so forgive me in that regard. But for those who are just starting out, a compassionate practice of just noticing, as Lesley has said in other conversations, interesting. But really notice and take it in and realize that it may not be true. Just allow for the possibility that it may not be true. Just starting with that practice. And then really getting the courage to notice where that does come up. People are kind of afraid to kind of own like what they might feel inside about anybody. But then when they address that to somebody who is a person of color, you have to know it. Like you can't do it something, you can't change what you don't know. And then secondly, I really want to encourage people there's so much out there to read. There's so much out there to listen to. It's overwhelming a little bit. I'm, again, not an expert in all that's out there, but I could certainly give Lesley a short curated list of things that have been crossed my path, if she would like that, if it would be useful. But please just, it's easy to take charge of it these days. Just start with little things. So great. There's so much great stuff.
Thank you, Sarah. And actually, I will be happy to put that list right under your name on the podcast page on my website, so that when people go to re-listen to your episode, which I'm sure they'll do because they're going to want to write down names of references and books and what have you, your recommended reading list, your recommended video sites will be right there for them to access. So thank you very much for coming today.
Well, thank you so much too. Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in and listening. I sincerely hope that you received some beautiful nuggets that inspired and will trigger new thoughts and new ways of considering yourself in the world. And in parting, I would like to remind you, you are stronger and wiser than you know. And nothing is beyond you.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We hope you received inspiration for expanding your own social innovation and influence. Help us inspire others by sharing this episode and leaving your comments over at lesliemichaels.com/podcast. For more tips, insights, and support in creating a fully audacious, professional, and personal lifestyle you love, visit our Women We Should Know community on Facebook.